Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's tutorial, we are going to be learning how to make this dress with a queen hand neckline and a Basque waistline. If this is something you're interested in learning, keep watching and let's get started. For the upper part of this dress, I made use of a crepe fabric, which is 1 yard. For the lower part of the dress, I made use of an Ankara print fabric, which is 1.5 yard. For the sleeve, I made use of a chanceau lace, which is half yard. For the lining, I made use of 2 yards. For the velvet ribbon I used for the eyelets, I made use of 3 yards. And I made use of 12 eyelets. To draft the pattern for the upper part of this dress, I folded my pattern paper into two. So I went ahead to rule a straight line, which is the starting line, and it is also referred to as the shoulder line. So I placed my measuring tape from the shoulder to mark my bust point. My shoulder to bust point for me is at this point, so I marked it. And still leaving the tape at the shoulder, I'm going to mark my under bust. And then the next line is the waistline. Now I'll go ahead to rule a straight line across this point. Now to get the basque extension, I placed my measuring tape from the waistline to mark 5 inches. So this depends on how long you want the basque to be. Now I went ahead to rule a straight line across this point. Now I would label this as the bust point, the under bust, the waistline, and the full length of the front piece of my top. Now from the center fold of the starting line, I went in to mark 3 inches, which is my neck width. And from the center fold of the starting line again, I would mark my shoulder measurements divided by 2 inches. To get the shoulder slope, I marked 1 inch below the shoulder point and I connected the shoulder slope to the neck width. Now from my shoulder slope, I'm going to measure down to my armhole depth. And I would rule a straight line across this point. And this line would be labeled as the chest line. Now from the shoulder slope, I'm going to draw a straight line to meet the chest line. Now to get the armhole curve, I placed my measuring tape on the chest line to mark my bust circumference divided by 4. And on the armhole line, I placed my measuring tape and folded it into two to get the midpoint. Now from this midpoint, I went in by ½ inch to connect these 3 points together. So take note that I would use this armhole as a guide in getting my actual armhole, and the reason is because of the Queen Anne neckline I am trying to achieve. And as we go deep into the tutorial, you understand better. The next step is to mark the neck depth. So from my shoulder, I marked 6 inches. So it depends on how deep you want yours to be, but I don't want my cleavage to be exposed. Now I'm going to rule a straight line across this point. The next step is to mark the dart. From the center of the neck depth, I placed my measuring tape to mark my nipple to nipple distance divided by 2 plus ½ inch. And then whatever I got, I kept marking it from the center of the bust line, the under bust line, the waistline, and the length line to connect all points together. Now I'm going to be drawing out the bustier. On the under bust line, on this side going towards the center, I marked ½ inch. On the waistline, on this side going towards the center, I marked ½ inch. On the M line, on this side going towards the center, I marked ½ inch. Now on the under bust line, on this side going towards the side, I marked 1.5 inches. And on the waistline, on this side going towards the side, I marked 1.5 inches. Now for the M line, I would mark 1 inch. Now I'm going to go ahead to connect these 3 points together. So on this side going towards the side, I connected the under bust dart to the waist dart because they are of the same measurements. And then I extended the waist dart to meet the dart on the hem line. The next thing to do is to mark 1 inch below the bust point and then connect the under bust dart to meet this point I marked using the curved side of my ruler. The next step is to connect the dart to the neck depth. To do this, I marked half inch inward, and from this other side I marked 1 inch, and I went ahead to mark 1 inch above my bust point to connect these 3 points together using the curved side of my ruler. So I'm just going to blend the curve. So since this is a cut together shoulder dress, the dart on the neck depth would affect the armhole. To prevent this from happening, I took the measurement of the dart opening on my neck depth. So this is 1.5 inches. Now I would replace that 1.5 inches to the neck depth line on this side. So now I extended the neck depth line to meet this point. The next thing I did was to replace this dart opening, which is 1.5 inches, to the bust circumference as well. I would also replace this 1.5 inches to the shoulder slope as well. Now I would connect these 3 points together to form my actual armhole curve. This dart opening on the neck depth line would also affect the neck width. So that is, it will practically make my neck width to be smaller than my preferred measurements, which isn't supposed to be. So to prevent this, so after my neck width, I subtracted the 1.5 inches from that point. Now I'm going to extend my new neck width to meet my shoulder slope. Now to get my queen hand neckline, I placed my measuring tape on the armhole region where I have the neck depth line to mark 2.5 inches. So this depends on you. You might want yours to be slimmer than mine. You can then reduce it to 2 inches. So it depends on you. Now, after I marked these 2.5 inches, I would connect this point to meet the neck width. Now you can also decide to use the straight side of your ruler or the curved side of your ruler, just like I did for mine. So I'm just going to blend this line together. Alright, so once this is done, you can decide to make yours a sweetheart neckline, or you can make it straight the way it is this way. But I want mine to be a sweetheart neckline. So from my shoulder, I marked 7 inches as the neck depth for the sweetheart. Then I connected this center point to meet the dart on the side. So on the chest line, I've actually placed my bust circumference already, and I've also replaced the darts on this side as well. So what is left is for me to place my waist circumference directly on the waistline. So I placed my waist circumference divided by 4 inches. Now I took the dart opening measurements, and this is 2 inches. I would replace it back to the waist circumference, and then I would connect my bust circumference to meet the waist circumference. The next thing I did is to connect the waist circumference to meet the center of the back's extension. So this is all for the front piece of the upper part of my dress. So I'll go ahead to cut this out. So I labeled this part as my center front, and I labeled this other side as the sides of the front piece. To draft the pattern for the back piece, I folded the pattern paper into two, And from the center of the fold, I marked 2 inches, which would be for the zipper allowance. Now I connected all points together to form a straight line. Now I'll go ahead to roll my shoulder line. Now I place the measuring tape from the shoulder line to mark my bust point. And I would also mark my waistline. Now I would rule a straight line across this point. To label this line as the bust point line and this other line as the waistline. After the zipper allowance, I placed my measuring tape on the shoulder line to mark my neck width of 3 inches, and I marked a neck depth of 1 inch to connect both points together to form a curved neckline. So after the zipper allowance again, I placed my measuring tape to mark my shoulder measurements divided by 2. To get my shoulder slope, I marked 1 inch below the shoulder point and I connected my neck width to this point. To mark my chest line, I placed my measuring tape from the shoulder slope to mark 7.2 inches, and then I ruled a straight line across this point to label this line as my chest line. Using my straight ruler, I connected the shoulder slope to the chest line. Now on the chest line, I placed my bust circumference divided by 4 inches, and this was after the zipper allowance. Now I would place my measuring tape on the armhole line to get the midpoint. To connect these 3 points together, now to get the open back design, I would go ahead to place my tape from the shoulder to mark the neck depth opening. I want mine to be 6 inches because I don't want my back to be very exposed. So I'm going to rule a straight line across this point. And the next step would be on how to get the dart. The next thing is to mark my dimple to nipple distance divided by 2 plus ½ inch on the neck opening line, the chest line, the bust point line, and the waist line to connect the 4 points together. On the dart line, I marked 1 inch below the neck opening line, and then on the waistline, I marked ½ inch on both sides to connect the 3 points together. So since I've already placed my bust circumference on the chest line, I'll just go ahead to take the dart opening measurement here. This is 1/4 inch and I replaced it here. So I'm just going to extend my armhole curve to meet that point. Alright, now on the waistline, I'll place my waist circumference divided by 4 inches. And then I'll go ahead to take the measurements of the dart opening here. This is 1 inch. I'll replace it here as well to connect the bust circumference to the waist circumference. Now I'm going to extend the waistline to the zipper allowance, and I would also extend the neck depth of the open back to the zipper allowance. So for the part to which the button and the loop would be attached to, I would place my measuring tape from the neck width to mark 1.5 inches, and then I would connect this point to the neck depth. From the open back neck depth leading to the armhole region, I marked 2.5 inches distance away from the armhole to connect this point to meet this other point using the curved side of my ruler. From the waistline of the zipper allowance, I went in to mark ½ inch here to connect this point to the open back, and this would help us to prevent the back of the dress from bulging when the zipper has been fixed later. So this is all for the back pattern. I'll go ahead to cut it out. For the waist dart, you can actually leave it this way without cutting out the dart, so that when sewing the back of the dress, you can easily fold it in by half inch. But for my own case, I have the intentions of installing an eyelet, and for that reason, I would have to open my dart. But if you are not installing an eyelet, you can just secure the dart by half inch when you are sewing the fabric. So this side will be labeled as the center back, while this other side will be labeled as the sides for the back. The next step is to place the patterns on the fabric. Now for the center front of the pattern, I placed it on the main fabric and I added half inch sewing allowance to the sides. And I also did the same for the lining as well. For the sides of the front piece, I placed the pattern on the fabric to cut out and I added half inch sewing allowance to the armhole, to the shoulder, to the neckline, to the bust curve, to the under bust, and to the length of the top. Now for the side, I added 1.5 inches sewing allowance. And then I used this pattern to also cut the lining and the interfacing. For the interfacing, I made use of a paper stay. So I ironed the interfacing on the wrong side of the fabric and I went ahead to place a wording which started from the neck depth to the under bust. But if you are someone that doesn't have issue with wording their clothes, I would advise you to just word this front piece from the neck depth to the full length of the blouse so that it covers the back's extension as well. Now I'm going to take these pieces to the ironing board to use the iron to glue the wording as well. The next step is to attach the center of the front piece to the sides of the front piece by half inch. So I'm just going to go ahead to pin this together. Now take note that whatever I do for the main fabric, I would also repeat it for the lining. After stitching, I would go ahead to notch the under bust and then I would notch the curved parts as well. I'll do the same for the other side. I'll take the front piece to my ironing board to open the seam allowance and then iron it properly. After ironing the front piece, this is how it should be. Now, I've also secured the lining for the front piece. I would place the right side of the lining on the right side of my main fabric. So I'm going to stitch the neckline following the direction of my chalk. When I get to this point, I would raise the machine footer up, then stitch it to the V shape. I'll raise the machine footer up, stitch it here to raise the machine footer up again. So that's how you should sew yours. After doing that, I'll go ahead to notch the neckline. Now I took my front piece to the sewing machine to stitch the sides by half inch. After stitching the sides, I turned the fabric to the right side and this is how it should be once you've ironed it properly. The next thing is to pin the bottom of both the fabric and the lining together. Now to make sure that the back shape is equal at the bottom, I would fold the front piece into two equally to trim out the excess fabric at the edges. Now I flipped it to the other side to be sure it's equal. Alright, so I've completed the front piece. Now I'll go ahead to work on the back piece. So this is my back piece and I've also placed the pattern paper on my fabric to cut out the back piece. For the center of the back piece, I added half inch to all the sides. For the sides of the back piece, I added half-inch seam allowance to the neckline, the armhole, and this other side had to be attached to the center back. Now for the other side, I added 1.5 inches, just the way I did for the front piece. And I placed this on my pattern paper to cut out exactly the same shape. So I would be gumming this pattern paper to the lining and to the main fabric as well. So this is my main fabric here. I would have just attached the center back of this part to this other part by half-inch, but because I want to attach an eyelet to this, I'll just keep that aside for now. So this is the fabric I'll be using for the eyelets. The width of this fabric is 4 inches, while the length of the fabric is about the same length with the length of the center back. This is 10 inches here, while this is 11 inches. And I also gummed a paper stay on the wrong side of this band. Now I'll go ahead to fold the band into two this way to stitch the top of the band by half-inch. And I'll repeat the same sewing process for the second band. To place the eyelet band, I marked half-inch away from the top of the open neckline. Then I placed this side directly on it, right side to right side, facing each other to stitch by half-inch. And for the second side, I repeated the same sewing process. As for the lining, I'll repeat the same sewing process. Now I'm going to trim out the excess band. The next step is to place the lining on the back piece. Now I'll take this to the sewing machine to stitch the neckline following the direction of my chalk, and I would also stitch this side where the button is going to be attached to, and I'll keep stitching. When I get to this point, I'll raise the machine footer up to keep stitching to this point, and then I would close the side by half-inch as well, and I would secure the other side by half-inch. For the second side of the back piece, I made a loop which is 4 inches long, and I folded it into two to place it directly on the midpoint of this side. Now I placed the lining directly on it to stitch following the direction of the chalk. After stitching, I notched the seams on the open back and on the neckline, and then I turned it to the right side of the fabric. So I used the pin to secure the zipper allowance at the center back of the top, and then I would place the right side of the front piece directly on the right side of the back piece to stitch the shoulders together by half-inch, making sure that the crepe fabric is on each other and the lining is on each other. So I took the top to the sewing machine to stitch the shoulders together, and I did the same for the second shoulder. After the shoulders were attached together, the next step is to cut out a little piece from the waistline of the center back piece, and this would help us to prevent the zipper from bulging at the back. From the center waistline on the zipper allowance, I marked half-inch above the waistline, and I connected the point to the end of the side to connect both points together, and this formed a slant line. Now I went ahead to trim out the excess fabric here. So this technique would prevent the center back from bulging after the zipper has been fixed. Alright, so the next thing I did was to install my eyelets, and to do this I had to mark the points I want the eyelet to be fixed on. So from the top of the eyelet band, I marked half inch, and after then I marked 1.5 inches intervals from each other. Make sure you're marking this on the center of the, so I kept marking 1.5 inches until I got to the waistline. Alright, so at this other side I marked half inch from the top of the eyelet band as well, and then I kept marking 1.5 inches so that each point on both sides would align. So I'm just going to make the eyelet directly on the point I chopped. So the eyelet has been properly fixed, and this is how it should be on both sides. The next step is on how to make the lower parts of this dress, which is the skirt. For the skirt, I folded the Ankara fabric into two, and I folded it into two again. So I practically folded this fabric into four, and I went ahead to leave a zipper allowance of 2 inches on this side. The first step is to leave half-inch sewing allowance from the top of the fabric and then rule the starting line. And this starting line is also called the waistline. Now from the waistline, I would mark my hip line, which is 10 inches. And from the waistline again, I would mark the full length of my skirt, which is 42 inches. So I added extra 1 inch sewing allowance to the hem, which made it 43 inches altogether. From the center fold of the fabric, I placed my measuring tape on the waistline to mark my waistline divided by 4 inches. Now I added 1 inch for the dart allowance, which would be on the waistline. And I would also add 1.5 inches sewing allowance to the side. On the hip line, I marked my hip circumference divided by 4, and I added extra 1.5 inches sewing allowance to the side. So I connected my waist circumference to the hip circumference. Now on the hem line, I marked just my hip circumference from the center of the fold without adding any allowance to that. Then I connected my hip circumference to meet the points I marked on the hem line. So the next step is to mark the butt spacing on the zipper allowance. So the butt spacing would help you to prevent the skirt from pressing your butt at the center back. Now on the waistline, I marked 1.5 inches on the zipper allowance. On the hip line, I marked 2 inches from the zipper allowance, and on the hem line, I marked 1.5 inches. Now I'm going to connect the 3 points together. So the butt spacing technique is very important, mostly with people with large butts, so that the butts can relax properly at the center back of the skirt. Now I'm going to cut out the skirt. Now I'm going to notch the zip allowance at the top, and I would also notch the hip line by the side. Now recall that I added 1 inch that allowance to the waistline. So basically the front piece of the skirt isn't supposed to have a dart, since I would be attaching a box to the waistline of the front piece. Now to eliminate these darts that I added initially, I'm going to subtract the 1 inch dart from this side, and then I would connect this point to my hip circumference. After deducting the waist dart from this front piece of the skirt, I placed both the front piece and the back piece of the skirt on the lining to cut out exactly the same shape, making sure that the lining is 1 inch shorter than the actual fabric. Now I'm going to place the lining directly on the right side of my Ankara piece. I pinned the bottom of the skirt together to stitch by 1/2 inch. After stitching, I adjusted the lining to the top of the waistline on the main fabric to stitch the sides. And when you get to the end, you notice that the lining is going to lift the Ankara a bit to this other side, so that the Ankara would be very neat at the bottom. So I repeated the same sewing process for the back piece of the skirt by stitching the bottom first by half inch and then adjusting the waistline of the lining to meet the waistline of the main fabric, then stitching the sides by half inch. This is the second part of the back piece and I repeated the same sewing process. After stitching, I turned the fabric to the right side and I ironed it properly. Now I placed the back pieces of the skirt on each other and then I went ahead to fold the front piece of the skirt into two. Now I'm going to place the center fold of the front piece directly on the point I notched for the zipper allowance. So this is why notching is very important. At this point, I'm going to roll my zipper allowance from this side. So the reason I did this is for me to know the point where the waist dart would be on the back piece. Remember that there is no waist dart on the front piece, and that is the reason why there is a spacing on this other side. Now to mark the waist dart, I divided my nipple to nipple distance into two and I added half inch to that. So that's 3.5 inches. Now I placed my tip from the line I marked for the zipper allowance to mark 3.5 inches. I went ahead to notch the waist dart. Now from the waist dart, I would mark my dart length, which is 5 inches, and I took the skirt to the sewing machine to stitch the dart by half inch, and I did the same for the second part. After stitching the dart, this is how it should be. The next step is to attach the front piece of the blouse, which has the backs, to the front piece of the skirt. Recall that during the drafting process, I marked 5 inches as my back's extension. Now I'm going to really straight line on the center of the skirt, and then I would have half inch to the 5 inches, which would be for joining allowance, and that will be 5.5. Now I marked 5.5 inches directly on this straight line. The next thing I did was to place the center of the back's extension directly on this point I chalked. Now I'm going to trace out the triangular shape. So I'm not going to cut directly on this line. I would add half inch to the top of this line, which would be for the joining allowance. Now I'm going to flip the front piece to the wrong side and then I would make sure that the sharp edges on the V shape is directly on each other. Now I'm going to pin this together. After pinning the center together, I'm going to notch the center of the V shape so that I can easily adjust the upper piece and the lower piece together. So now I'm going to adjust one side of the upper piece to meet this end here to stitch by half inch. So after stitching this side, I would also adjust this other side of the front piece to meet the skirt on this side. Now I'll take this to the sewing machine to stitch by half inch, following the direction of my finger. So the front piece has been properly stitched together. And the next thing I did is to place the back piece of the skirt directly on the back piece of the upper part to stitch the waistline by half inch. So the back piece of my dress has been properly stitched together. Now I placed one side of the back piece directly on the other, right side to right side facing each other. Now I'm also going to fold the front piece of my dress into two equally. The next step is to place the front piece of my dress directly on the back piece of my dress. So the reason I did this is because I want to confirm if the zipper allowance is still accurate at the center back of this dress. So from what I can see here, the zipper allowance at the skirt part is correct. Now for the zipper allowance at the upper part of this dress, I'll just go ahead to use my chalk to connect it to the zipper allowance on the skirt. Now to mark my zipper opening, I placed my measuring tape from the neck opening to mark 16 inches. So from this point to 16 inches is where the zipper would be. Now from this point I marked 13 inches in length. I'll take this to the sewing machine to stitch directly from this point down to this 13 inches, and this other side will be for the slit opening at the center back so that conveniently work. All right, I've made the stitching and you can see I've also used my hemming gum to secure the slits at the center back of this dress. So the next step is to pin the sides of the dress together, and then I would go ahead to mark my bust circumference, waist circumference, hip circumference, and the hem circumference on the back piece of this dress. After which I will take this to the sewing machine to stitch following the direction of the chalk. After stitching the sides of the dress, I turned it to the right side of the fabric. The next step is to attach my sleeves to the armhole of the dress. The final step for me is to attach the button directly on this extension, and then I would also insert the ribbon into the highlights. All right guys, so this is the final outcome of this dress and I hope this tutorial was helpful. You should give it a try, and if you're new to my channel, please subscribe, share and like my tutorials, and also put on your notification bell to be notified when I upload new tutorials. Thanks for watching and see you in my next tutorial.